Now, what I want to get to is the styles of black leadership. We started this out, we really didn't flesh it out a lot, but it has been said that the major anomaly of black leadership is that black leaders were not chosen. Black people have not chosen their own leaders, more or less. They were thrust upon them. And again, we're talking about styles of black leadership. Black leadership has depended on white as well as black recognition of their claims to speak for the race. Again, black leaders, that is regardless of their ideological stance, black leaders have depended upon both white and black. They've depended on whites and blacks, black recognition, in their claims to speak for the race. Next point. Prestige in the black community is seen as both, underline, cause and effect of prestige in the white community. Again, prestige within the black community is seen as both a cause and effect of prestige in the white community. Let me stop here a minute. So what do you feel about the whole idea of black leaders, black America having their leaders, having been told who their leaders are? Real quick, I don't spend a whole lot of time on it. I want to get to Frederick Douglas.
It's a true statement.
And she says true.
Yeah, because no black leader, if you go back historically, was ever stood up and raised their hand and say, I'm gonna be the leader of the black people. I'm gonna speak for the black people. It's always been someone we feel we trust, or someone that we know, or somebody that speaks eloquently.
Okay. Everybody agree? Disagree? Let me hear an opposing voice. You kind of said, sort of, kind of, totally agree, halfway agree.
I guess to kind of on the other side, you could say that the people pick the leader, and then the leader doesn't necessarily, speak out and say, oh, I'm gonna do this. We kind of, like she said, we go to somebody we trust, and since we trust them, we do trust them to take that leadership role and that leadership position, because we trust them, I guess.
Okay. Anybody else? Roll it over and think about it. Okay, especially when we start going through these individuals. I want you to pay attention to how they evolve to the center of the stage. Okay. The next point I made was what? Black leaders, regardless of their ideology, depended on white as well as, it kind of ties in with that. They have depended on white recognition as well as black recognition in their claims to be the spokesperson for the race. And get this one, prestige in the black community is both cause and effect of what?
Prestige in the white community.
Explain, real quick. Okay, please.
If you're kind of well-liked in the white community, it could perhaps make you less liked in the black community. And if you're
Now in this case, not less liked, but more liked. Why?
I look at it as seeing more so like the cream of the crop of the black community. You have that person that can represent that black or that population within the white society. That's how I look at it.
I think we can see it in operation more. I'm gonna ask you, do you see it more so now? What is the value of that statement today?
Yes. And it's like, I mean, just look at, Barack Obama. He was well liked in the black community, but he was able to speak to the white community and make them feel empowered just as much as he did the black community. And that's why he was, elected a second term.
Okay, let me hear from someone else.
I feel as though like in terms of like with Barack Obama,
brought up a good point, we're gonna come back to that, I don't know if we get to it today, might touch on it just a little bit. Let me hear somebody else on that prestige of cause and effect. I think it's still in operation, they maybe not to the same extent, but back in the day when most black people didn't have that connection with the white community, the very fact that I'm the black person and I have connection with the people downtown, does that not elevate me in the eyes of my people? Or we can go to him because he has connection with the white people downtown. I'm laying this out, so as we go through these people, you can think a little bit clearly, a little bit more deeply about these things. These are things, this is not my saying, this is what has been written. And definitely, if you're the big preacher, and that still kind of goes on the black community, in the black community, the people love you. So guess who the white people gonna search out when they want something? Because you have this prestige among your people, we definitely want to speak to you. And vice versa, when you have connection with them, that elevates you even more in the eyes of your black people, your black community people. I can tell you, I know this person because my husband's a pastor. Whenever there's a city thing going on here, you can bet they're going to call Joseph Walker. Not just him, but him. You would definitely be in there. I've been in mayoral meetings and what have you. So they're going to call the iconic figures in the black community. That still goes on to this day. Maybe not as much, I don't know. I'm not even settled with that issue, but it still goes on. Okay. We left here one day and I was telling you, this kind of has some bearing on these questions. I told you we had a white provost, and I'm talking about Professor Hanley that just left, this was some years ago. His name was Smythe, I can put this is public, it's no secret. And he did, it may have been a Martin Luther King convocation, one of those convocations, so he spoke, and his paper was entitled, What White People Love About Martin Luther King. It ties in with your comment. And it's because sometimes we have that, but again, this is an example of white America still telling you who your leaders are. Because Martin Luther King was more accommodationist and more of the integrationist and advocated working within the system, of course they loved what he was saying as opposed to what a Malcolm X was saying. So they love the blacks that are not, in their eyes, gonna shake or rock the boat.
It's like the difference between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois.
So they're still telling you, so sometimes the radical leader plays a role too in them telling you and ordaining and telling you who your leader will be. And it depends on what they are espousing. Can you see that? That was the gist of his speech. That's basically what he's saying, because he was more accommodationist, if you want to call it that, and Malcolm X was not. Definitely King, and you know, even to this day, King gets more press, or better press, I should say, than Malcolm X. Would you agree? Yeah. Because of what they were saying. Okay. One of several small little points here. We touched on this. Blacks have never, contrary to what many have said, they have never just sat back and just accepted their plight as is. They have always protested, always. So there's always been this element of protest and the protesting voice. They just had different means of doing it. Some called for, again, violence. Some call for accommodation. More so we get into Frederick Douglas. We're going to talk about him in a few minutes. Some call for immigration, leaving. They had actually asked to immigrate to Africa, Central America, and South America. Leave. Nothing is going to happen as long as we're here. You're going to give us this area, and we can go do our own thing. That comes under the separatist banner. Some even use spiritual escape. I think black people are, and please don't be offended, but I think they're very religious. I have my own definition of religious. But a lot of it goes back to that. It was an escape mechanism, otherworldly. That's how you deal with your situation. That's why, was it and we're gonna get to it, I think, in Cornell West, since I get my books mixed up, but, that's why X never cared for religion per se. Because somebody said that religion was kind of the opium of the people. You're taught otherworldly and you're not really dealing with the right now world.
Yeah.
So that's why you would see them singing their spiritual songs, their hymns, and praying, and all those things was a form of what? Escape. Then some you've seen in some of these movies. My husband doesn't like those movies. My mom, I don't know why, I love historical, I love slave movies, I love that kind of stuff. Some people say it makes them very angry, but I like those things. But the point being, you've seen it in some of these movies, but a lot of times they would just fake being sick. They would put things in the food. They would do all kinds of things, set the place on fire, and act like no, so they always had ways of fighting back. And then you had those real protest forces. When I say advocate violence, I'm talking about revolution, revolting. Some of the names: Nat Turner, we mentioned it here before, Gabriel Prosser. Who else? Denmark Vesey. So we've always protested the situation of Black America. So it wasn't like we just gonna, sit here and die and just things the way that they are. There have always been activism, one way or the other. Okay. There was one other point that I wanted to make. Yes. The root for the more conciliatory approach to dealing with the Black plight has its roots in the free Blacks of the South. And radical Black leadership has its roots in the free Blacks of the North.
Can you read that?
Okay. The more conciliatory approach to politics has its roots in the free Blacks of the South. The more radical approach has its roots to the free Blacks of the North. So Blacks, free Blacks in a nutshell, you had a lot of them, and a lot of them were in the South. They created their own institutions, their own alternative ways of life. They were all, even though they were free, they were always in the danger of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. So that was always kind of, it becomes a question of how really free you are if this is always, over your head. But the point is, when we describe them, they were usually the more skilled, better educated, get this, lighter skin Blacks. This put them a notch, if you will, above the masses of other Blacks. And this is the point. They would not, and felt like they could not, join hands with the slaves. Can you see this divide and conquer thing? Because their livelihood depended on them keeping separate from their brothers and sisters. So you can see why they would not want to shake or rock the boat. So these group of people favored a conciliatory racial politics. Hence we call it conservatism. Yes?
And I keep getting confused. Was it the free Blacks of the South or the North that were?
This is South.
The South was more radical.
No. Conciliatory. And the reason, let me move up north for a minute just for this purpose. The Blacks in the North, even though they were not slaves, didn't have that banner of being, taken back into slavery, they still were not a whole lot better off than slaves because they didn't have much and they didn't have a lot to do. There was racial segregation. Also, they couldn't do anything. You're free to do what? You had only rudimentary, elementary education, just a little bit. They They had competition from other immigrants. How many of you know there was a tension between other black immigrants and blacks? American blacks, if you will. So life wasn't, my point is, wasn't all that great for them also. So they began to speak, my point is, but they were more radical in their speech. And they were allowed to. And they usually did it through newspapers or pamphlets. Why do you think they were allowed to be more radical in their voice?
Only because there were more white people that felt the same way as they did.
That's true. And also, I'm not going to I'll say it later. But the fact that you had more blacks in the South, there was a white fear. So there was more control on you in the South. Whereas blacks were outnumbered in the North, so they weren't as what, and then kind of got a different mindset, not all that different, but a little different mindset among your whites in the North, so blacks were allowed to speak a little bit more radically. So hence we have the roots, if you will, of a conservative approach to, speaking to your situation, and in the North we have the roots to the what? More radical voices. Questions or comments? And by the way, some of these free blacks and the lighter hue and had a little bit more education, a little more stuff. This is why, even the roots of your fraternities and sororities, they began to look and start their own organizations and took pride in them. Even the old black church. One of the oldest black churches is the AME African Church. What is this? African Methodist Episcopal Church. Who's the leader? What's his name? Alan. What's the first name?
Alan.
Richard. Is it Richard?
No, Wilson. No.
Is it Robert Allen? No.
I don't know. Somebody look it up, but yeah.
Um,
But again, we had our own, because y'all know from these movies what you've read. Even those that worship, you had to worship, this is crazy, separately. So they began, and when they threw out Richard Allen and whatever the other guy's name was, they were in there actually on their knees praying, and people threw them out. So they say, you know what, enough is enough. They started their own. So my point, black people have always found it necessary to start their own organizations, even their own black churches. But you have the AME Church, it started during this era, and I think he was the first, was the title bishop? I don't remember quite, but you can look it up. So are we clear? So this is what's going on, but the point I'm making is blacks never just sat back idly and just said, oh me, oh mine, we're gonna pray to God and blah, blah, blah. They took action one way or the other to protest this situation. So you've always had these black voices. Okay, having said that, let's go with our first group of all minds are clear, which is Mr. Frederick Douglas.
It's okay if we look it on.
Yep. So you said it's because I need to report this not coming on period?
Yeah, I couldn't get it to turn on. I'm not.
I'll have some.
Is the CPU on? You voted?
Well, yeah, it's the actual computer down here is on. Or was. See, at first I was on that
Well, we had Mr. Frederick Douglass. He was born in 1818 and passed away in 1895. So starting with some historical background, his time period started in slavery, and he was born into slavery in Maryland. His mother was a slave, and his father was their slave master, so he was mixed. Towards the middle of his life, it was the American Civil War was uprising and coming into play. And towards the end of his life, he could see the failure of Reconstruction, and he had some activism in that as well. So for some personal background, he was born into slavery. He tried to escape slavery a couple times. One time he was found out, and of course he couldn't leave. And he finally escaped, and he met his wife, because she also escaped a couple months later after him. And they changed their name after they got married to Johnson, but later to Douglas. After he escaped, and he had some educational roots with his slave master, like the mistress. And so she taught him his alphabet and everything before her husband was saying, if you're teaching him this, you're basically raising him to think it's okay to rise against us, like he's not on our level, so you can't educate him. And so she stopped educating him, but he still snuck around and would read and learn from other schoolboys, and he would read documents on his own. So he was very curious and wanted to know about the world. And so when he came back to, when he left and when he was free, so he, okay. After he was free, he was writing a book, like the narrative of his life, and it was called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglas, written by himself. So he wrote an autobiography, and it basically told everything. So even like his slave master's name, and so since he had escaped slavery, he was scared that he would be forced back into slavery. So he did a book tour and went to the British Isles and toured Britain, England, Ireland, and Scotland. And so he did a book tour for 2 years, and some abolitionist friends he had in America ended up buying his freedom, and so he came back to America. He had 2 wives. His first wife was Anne, and he had 5 kids by her. And after she passed away, he got remarried to a white lady.
Keep that, make note, because some people have made a point of that in history, so go ahead.
He got married to a white lady named Helen Pitts. She was also a suffragist and an activist for slavery. And so, it was a lot of controversy when he got married to her. Her kids, or his kids, were saying how it was like a direct, hate towards his mother, like he was trying to get something, he was trying to escape the life that he had with their mom, because she was black. And so his only comment on the situation was saying his first wife was the color of his mother, and his second was the color of his father. So his major thoughts, he felt that slavery was wrong, and he wanted to end slavery and segregation. He felt that everyone, he felt natural law, he agreed with natural law, so he felt that everyone had rights, and we shouldn't be fighting for something that we should have. Everyone should be free. Women's suffrage, so towards the end, Reconstruction of his life, he was an activist for women's rights, and he was until he passed away.
And so Mr. Douglas, being the great man that he is, did have a lot of strengths, and one of them was that he was a very respectable person. He spoke about that later on in his speech, what are colored people doing for themselves? And I remember last semester in Black politics class, we talked about what does it mean to be respectable. And so basically we talked about how some people, you don't really use them, put them in the forefront to speak about certain issues, even though they did go through a lot, because, they're just not somebody you would have as much sympathy for. So, for example, there was somebody before Rosa Parks, there were other people who didn't give up their seat on the bus. They just didn't get as much headlines because I think one girl was a teenager and her father was an alcoholic and she was rebellious. And then, other people had, I think another person had a child out of wedlock or something like that. Back in that time, that was like a big no-no. And so, I think in their mindset, a lot of people wouldn't take their issues seriously. They'll be like, oh, okay, but Rosa Parks was an older woman, and she had, people
okay, this older lady, she's been at work all day, she's coming home, she's getting on the bus, and now she has to stand up for this white lady, and people, it would show more, people would give more sympathy to her. They were playing at the heart, because when you play at the heart, you play at the mind. And so Douglas, being a former slave, and then escaping to New York and going through all that he went through, getting married and such, people had more sympathy for him, especially since he did grow up as a slave for most of his childhood. He learned how to read and write and play the violin, and he became a very notable speaker and author and such. Therefore, people thought, oh, okay, well, he's living the quote-unquote American dream. And so people, white people and black people, as we talked about earlier, looked at him like, okay, he's a respectable person. He can speak for the black people. And I think that's what a lot of white people really listened to him and thought of him as like one of the spokespeople for the black community at that time.
And he was very eloquent, which you alluded to, but he was so eloquent that when he would go speak, people did not believe that he had been a slave. And so he would always, have to, say, yeah, I did, that's why he did the slave marriages, but, I mean, he was such a orator, or whatever the word is. People just couldn't believe that this man was once, a slave.
And he was a very good writer. I mean, he can write better than, you would think that he's been writing his entire life, I know a lot of people, even me especially, like, I'm decent, but, for him to be a former slave, and it took him so long to even learn to read or write, and for him to write this well, I would kind of be dumbfounded too, especially back in that time, seeing that he's a former slave and he had to catch up to the white man. And so I think that's definitely one of his strengths. And also he was very influential since he accomplished so much. And since he, as we were talking about earlier, even in this class period, since he was, prestigious also in the white community, he was also prestigious in the black community. And so that made a lot of people listen to him. Even Abraham Lincoln, he had a couple meetings with him, which I'll talk about later. And he had meetings with other people in the black community. He gave a lot of speeches. Of course, he was an orator, he wrote books. And so, by that alone, he had ears to a lot of people. But he also had some weaknesses. And I think some of his weaknesses were, he knew how to write, he knew how to speak, but I guess to me he wasn't a good businessman, and this is what I mean by that. He often blamed black people. He published a newspaper, and he blamed black people for not buying his abolitionist newspaper. But first of all, black people, a lot of them, slavery was still going on at this point. A lot of them didn't know how to read and write, and the ones that didn't really have a lot of funds to subscribe to a newspaper. And so I think that even if they did, a lot of times, even to this day, like if you were to ask most black people in this university if they would rather read like the NAACP newspaper or would they rather read Chet or Ebony magazine, they would probably, at least I would probably, just because Jet is more entertaining, I would probably read Chet. Now, I'm not saying that I wouldn't read the NAACP, I just haven't before.
And he addresses that too, does he not?
Yeah. And so, I think a lot of times, yes, it is partially some black people's fault that maybe they are not getting as educated as they could, but I also think that it's partially on you. Maybe I think he could have made his newspaper more appealing to the black community or to whoever wanted, or to whoever his target audience was. I don't think that was entirely.
So that was my next question, who is he targeting? And again, that was part of that, I was saying up north where blacks, what was the name of the Liberator? Star, yeah, so you had all these newspapers, again, going on in the northern part, but who was he targeting? Because you made a great point, that some of these people could not read or write. who's your audience?
Is this a dialogue or no? Was
I
that a
mean,
quick?
we can give your opinion.
Oh,
I was thinking.
I'm sorry.
So jot down your questions, but yeah.
Oh, okay,
I
okay,
want to
okay.
finish. Go ahead.
And so, my third thing is, people do make assumptions about him. I assumed when I first read about him that he was very well educated, and he is educated, he does know how to read, write, and play the violin, but unlike W.E.B. Du Bois or some other black northerners, he wasn't, like, he didn't go to college, he didn't have a lot of the education that we do now, yet he still found a way to make a way for himself. And so some of his contemporaries were President Lincoln, and the reason why I said Lincoln is because he did have a few meetings with Abraham Lincoln, just talking about how they can help improve the conditions for black in the South, even though slavery was still going on. And Douglas mentioned how he was frustrated with the slowness of President Lincoln. He was saying he's just taking such incremental steps. But even though he said he was frustrated, he said he understood because, you know, even if you're the president, like I would like to believe if I was Abraham Lincoln, I would just free slavery and had all equal laws all in one day. But that's just not practical, you know. And so you do, especially in the United States, have to take a lot of times baby steps towards progressivism. And so he made that claim that, yeah, I'm frustrated with how slowly things are going, but he also understands why. And so, but he was just so influential that he even had the ear of the president, and I just think that was, especially for a black man at that time, I think that was just incredible. Another one of his contemporaries was a man named by William Lloyd Garrison.
Yeah.
He was also a Northern abolitionist. He was one of Douglas's first friends when he came to the North. And he was talking about how they both got kicked off of a train for not riding in coach, I think they said. And that kind of reminded me also of Rosa Parks. Like, again, she wasn't the first one to, you know, not sit where she was supposed to be sitting, quote unquote. And so they often, like again, I think Garrison also started a paper called the Liberator, yes, Liberator. And that was also an abolitionist paper. Douglas said it was the second most closest writing to his heart other than the Bible. And so they both had big influences on each other. And Sojourner Truth also lived in that time, was a black abolitionist who also freed or helped escape slaves, or helped slaves escape slavery, yes. And so they did cross paths at one point. Douglas was giving a speech about how he was frustrated with God for not freeing slavery after all these years. And then Truth stood up and said, is God dead? And then Douglas said he remembered David and Goliath. I assume, well, maybe don't. So David and Goliath, there was a little boy named David. He was looked over. Anyway, his country was fighting another country. David killed the giant or whatever. And so he was reminded of that passage and thought, okay, even though it's taken a long time towards progress can still be made. And so,
So for convergences and divergences, like she's saying, there were a lot of convergences that he had, like with Lincoln, but also with William Lloyd Garrison. So with the North Star, it was this thing because they did have competing newspapers that, oh, you should have a black-oriented newspaper because the white one is fine enough. Like, this one can touch everyone instead of just this group of people. So they were having some disputes over that because the North Star did fail in the end. And they also had some problems with moral suasion, and so that's just like appealing to someone's moral beliefs to like influence how they think or act politically. And so William Garrison was all for that, and so initiatives and make change instead of just, oh, well, you read this and you care now. So it's just, you know, he felt like change came from politics and not just talking.
Was he always that way?
Yeah.
Was he always that way?
I don't know, because he had some issues, in my opinion, where he was just like a little, I feel like he had some moral changes because like on the brink of the Civil War, he kind of got a little more radical with like the fugitive slave law of 1850 got passed, and he just felt like, okay, maybe talking isn't the way violence is. And so that was also, he felt like armed insurrection was a thing where you can just, the only way to end the institution of slavery is to arm slaves, and we're going to end this with violence, and we're going to come out on top. And so that was one of his convergences with John Brown, actually. And with the immigration to Africa, on the brink of the Civil War, a lot of people were, or slaves were debating, okay, do we stay here or do we go back home, or to what we assume is our home, you know? But so Henry Highland Garnet and Martin Delaney were saying, oh, we should go back to Africa and make things right there. But he was just saying, this is the land we grew up in, we know, let's make change here.
And so my response just to his whole life is that he is a very intelligent man. He's well-spoken. He did make a way. Well, he did have some help along the way, but for the most part, he had a drive in him to make it, and he did survive. He led a very accomplished life. He did write 3 autobiographies. He published a newspaper. He was the vice presidential candidate to in the Equal Rights Party, and he did have very close connections with people in high places, and so because of that, you know, people really look at him as like, oh, this great figure, especially in the Black community. But he did have very divisive and conservative views. Or at least today we would call it conservatives, because again, he did write a speech called "What Are Colored People Doing for Themselves?" And so, I mean, again, slavery was still going on, and so it really doesn't, to me, it's not fair to say, to point the finger at Black people, even free Black people, because if Irish people and Italians, even in the early 1900s, are complaining about, oh, they're treating me so unfairly, how much more do you think even free Blacks would be treated unfairly? I mean, they were making laws on the books about segregation at that time, and how Black people couldn't be well educated, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, again, for that time, that was very, very conservative, and I think it was a little unfair. But, so basically the speech entitled "What Are Colored People Doing for Themselves?" It was written
Can we
about.
stop there before we go there? Or just we going next?
Yeah.
Let's stop there for a minute. Okay, I want to discuss, Tim, because he did split with Garrison, right? Because he saw that organization as being very patronized and patriarchal, blah, blah, blah. So he found it necessary to split with them. And by the way, we also had some people, I think you may have been in that group, there was somebody here from somewhere, one of the law schools or something, back in the spring, if you remember. And most people don't know, because of his distinction and the way he carried himself, and I'm bringing this up because this will be a thread we'll be talking, he was respectable. I like that you used that word. I guess I hate to use the word, it was paid off. When I say it paid off for him, because one role that he played that most people don't know, he was an ambassador. He was appointed as ambassador to where? And that's what to Haiti. And I remember, were you in that group? Somebody came here and spoke. I can't remember where they were from, but I don't know, I had to leave early, but they spoke to us as a political science group back in the spring. And so he served in other capacities, and again, I'm using that word because he was deemed, you know, kind of respectable. He served also as a United States Marshal. He was the recorder of deeds for the DC or for District of Columbia. So he went on to be appointed into these positions. And again, that's big stuff, especially when you put it in that time frame. But if I were to ask you, he protested against segregation, the spread of segregation, white supremacy, a lot of these other things that we're doing. What did he feel about education itself? Because you're gonna see some convergence with Booker T. So he was an advocate of industrial education. So we'll talk about that. But what I want to get to is history records him as moving from militancy to conservatism. Do you think that's too strong? From militancy to conservatism.
In my opinion, I feel like it would be the opposite, you know, because I feel like he started, okay, I can see that, so maybe he did start a little radical, I guess, but, oh, yeah, okay, so he started, because it's making sense now, it's just like, okay, I don't know if it would be militant, but he was very radical, especially because he was just, I don't know, I feel like he just got tired, and just felt like, if violence is the only way to end this, that's what we're gonna do.
Some people think the fire had abated in his latter years, that the steam had kind of run out. What did you all say?
I think he was just getting, sometimes people just get more wise, like we were talking about the other class period, what's his name, John Lewis?
I was just thinking the same thing.
So y'all not wise now, right? Y'all gonna be wise when you get older, is that what you're saying?
No.
I say like, from what just like going from like the title of the thing, like what he was talking about in like the writing, it's like it's easy to start off militantly, you feel like you can have like a big following, but like if he really felt like, what are black people doing for themselves, it's kind of like, what's the point in the.
That's the thing, like, he was only 30 when he wrote this, or did the speech, so it's just like, he did get more conservative.
So you say he was around 30?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that he was able to be radical because he had so much white support behind him. Because if you think about it, like, he had to actually leave the country and go to England and go to the British Isles and go to Ireland. He had to go to all of these places, even for him to develop a name for himself. And I think because he was more cultured than, the average black person, white people respected him more. And I think that's why he was able to speak better, and also write better, because he was able to travel, and because he was able to go, away, and then come back, and he had white people to pay for him to become free. He didn't have to, he did leave, but he still had those white people that gave him that validation. And I think that, especially in this speech, he was more so an elitist, like a black elitist, without the education behind it. He was just like, we need to do it for ourselves, and if you're not helping me, then why should I help you? Type of attitude.
I think that he did get a little less radical or whatever towards his end of his life. And I think he got caught up in a little bit of like intersectionality when he started to align himself with the women's, women's rights suffrage, whatever they
He's
call
known
it.
as a feminist.
I think that's definitely a distraction. Like, I don't really go for all that stuff. I feel like when you start to align with too many other movements, it gets watered down, it gets lost a little bit. So I think even that statement that you said that he made at the end of his life about his first wife was the color of his mom and the second was the color of his dad, that's like total BS. I don't think that's something he would have said at the beginning of, like, when he first escaped from slavery. Because his father was also the color of his oppressor, the person that enslaved him, you know what I mean? So to say that's the color of my father is kind of like, you know what I mean? That's also the person that
I think he did that to make it okay. Like, it was basically him trying to make himself feel better, because what people don't really know is that his second wife was his secretary for over 50
Yeah,
years.
she did.
So they been
Right,
creeping.
they had a relationship
Wow.
way before
Disrespect.
his wife, passed away. And like, I remember, because I visited.
So he was cheating?
I visited Frederick Douglas' house in Washington, D.C.
And that's what point they say he retired in Washington, D.C. Big maker, plays But what you all are saying, I'm not saying it's true, but the argument is made in, all these publications or whatever, that some people attribute, and I know where they're coming from, I don't know if I totally agree, that now he's maybe tending to the white side or to that European side, even with the white wife. So he had definitely cooled down a little bit. You didn't see, I don't know if that was age, is it what they were saying, maybe it was an element of all of it.
Process in the beginning. I think early on in his life, even at age 30, when he was writing this, just listening to like everything that everybody's saying, it seems as though he felt closer to the white population, but couldn't put his foot out there all the way.
And here we go again, I'm going on, and just for, argument's sake or discussion, when you see, because, you all, let's face it, when we look at America, I'm just speaking of America today, I can never forget, I gotta tell this joke. My husband and I, it's not a joke, but it really actually happened. My husband and I, we traveled, this was years ago, and we were in France, right? And so we were getting ready to go on the subway, and it was this white lady with her little baby in the stroller, and the baby, you could clearly see the daddy was black, you could tell. And so when the lady was strolling her baby walking toward us, right, and we were coming in front. And so the little baby, you could actually see the little frown on her face, and then she turned around the stroller because we passed in, and she looked back, and she said, "Papa."
Oh my.
Oh, I didn't know you had children. But the child, again, I guess maybe.
She ain't know her daddy.
She don't
dark
see the
skin,
daddy.
whatever, the child thought my husband was her father. My point is, we live in a day, in time,
She must not see
where,
that that much. I ain't know.
you see a lot of black men with white women, right?
Just
And we see
disgusting.
these babies, do we not see them? We see them, they're everywhere. I mean, that's a phenomenon now, you can discuss that a little later. But the point being,
You said Papa.
do we force these people to choose? Because you are all of that.
I would have been
I
screaming.
mean, that is your mother. I don't care if she is white, if she's a symbol of the oppressor. That is your daddy. So do we force them to choose? And I'm not saying that's what he was saying. Like you said, maybe he was trying to make it all right. But you can Google yourself. But there's a lot of writings out there where people said he had calmed down and even identify more with that, even down to who he married. I think people should marry whoever they feel like they want to marry. That's their business. But again, for the dynamics of race and some of the racial discourse, these things come into operation. But that is what has been said concerning him. But you clearly did not see the same fervor that you saw at the beginning of his life. Now, what that is, we're only saying what has been said. Here, get back here.
I had a question, but I was asking, like, did he have a relationship with his father? Because the way he made that statement, like, my second wife was the skin of my dad, like, it made it seem like he was kind of like the dad that kind of took care of the kids low key.
No.
But not really.
Slave master.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I know some slave masters are kind of more lenient with their kids.
Like on Roots, when the slave master was more like a father figure to Chicken George, so yeah.
So, but I don't think he did, just like how he told the mistress to stop educating him or whatever, because, the uprising, but.
He didn't, but they did, I think, he met one of his slaves, I don't know if that was his father. He met one of the,
He met with her again.
I thought it was okay.
Because
Okay.
he was saying in his narrative, like, that was the person that had been the kindest to him and showed him the most kindness he had ever seen. And so I think he met with her again before she passed away.
Yeah, they reconciled.
Because he did use it as an excuse to marry.
Yeah,
his
I
wife.
felt like he
Yeah, he did.
So realize his daughter,
Yeah, he
like,
did.
basically disowned him after he married this white woman. She was like, absolutely not. I'm not gonna call her mother. I'm not gonna do anything. You
She knew.
disrespected me, so I'm gonna disrespect you. And I think because black people made him choose to be either you're gonna be all black or all white. You can't be in between. So he was like, well, she's the color of my father.
He knew he lost his man with that statement.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's talk about this again with the open mind. Was that a true statement, though?
It's a true
It's a true
statement.
I mean, he's both.
That's why I was asking,
I feel like he's both, but he used it to his advantage at that point. Like, you know how when you just say something just because you could just say it because it's true and relevant, but it didn't make no
So I
sense.
feel like that was just his response, like the controversy, like, cause there was so
Yeah,
many
like
people
what?
coming at him, even his
Yeah, a
family,
lot.
like, yeah, he was getting a lot of hate, and so was she, like, her family disowned her too, like, they did not talk to her.
Well, we already
She
know
never-
that.
And so I don't know if that was just his response to the statement, because it is true. It's just like, is it fair for us to be like, oh, he can't acknowledge that he is half white? Because he is, like,
And wasn't he like 75?
He better go and find him somebody to
Oh,
play
was
with.
he?
Really old,
couple
when he
years
married
ago.
her. He was like almost dead himself. I mean.
Almost dead.
Okay.
You gotta work on your wording.
As someone who's like very, very far away from mixed race, my opinion on the matter is basically that, like, if it's somebody that literally has like two loving parents or whatever, and one of them is black, one of them is white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever, you know what I mean? That's different, I guess. But if this person is literally a slave master, trying to justify, well, maybe he was a nice slave master, you know what I mean? To try to say why it's okay.
And didn't he
That
rape
just,
them
to
too?
me, just, I don't get it, but, you know.
I think he meant it in a way of, when we were talking last week about politics and how people in power will say things and do certain things to appeal to both crowds. I think that it was really just that, to appeal to both crowds. I think it was his way of reaching the white community and reaching the black community.
But at the time, was it really reaching the white community? Because
They don't agree with it.
Well,
Maybe not with
obviously
that.
not, but I mean, in his little circle, I mean, his wife was white, so he could, in his head somewhere, think that he is somehow included in that.
And that's what I want to say, even for the rest of, when we talk about assumptions, not necessarily our assumptions, but what are these people assuming in their, you know, their, whatever it is that they're espousing in their arguments. What assumptions, and were they faulty assumptions? So what is Douglas, from what you can see, was he assuming anything that may not have been sound? For instance, when you said, when he wrote, and I want to deal with it just a little bit, what are colored people doing for themselves? What is he assuming? Because anywhere you come from a standpoint, you're automatically making some assumptions, whether you know it or not.
I think he's assuming that since he was a slave and since his slave master's mistress taught him how to read and write, and little white boys in the neighborhood taught him how to play the violin, that other black people can do the same thing. But at the same time, like, this was back before child labor laws. And a lot of black people, even if they weren't slaves, a lot of the children were not in school. A lot of them were working to help their families make ends meet. And so it's hard to assume that, you know, people can just be successful like he can. I mean, I think he was just more blessed than he was living in reality, because most black people could not.
Was he aiming at the free blacks? That's why I asked you, who is his audience?
oh, he had to be then. Because this was 1848, slavery, or not slavery, the Civil War wasn't until like 1850s. So he couldn't have been talking to the slave blacks, because it's just like, why would you, I don't know, maybe he
How
was,
would you
yeah.
make a way for yourself? I
Was
mean,
he
even
leading up to, like, because he had the ear of President Lincoln, I'm just
He
thinking,
didn't at this time.
so he didn't have the ear of Lincoln at this time. So it was just,
Was it hope?
right. Was it just a thought that we see times are changing, or I can see the times are changing, and we need to, because in his speech, he alluded to that the white people making ways for black people. Like, they're moving out of the way for us to be better, but we're not taking on that. That's, I mean, that's what I saw.
Right. I do see what you're saying. I agree, I disagree with his statement when he says that, because I think that even now, I think black people are given opportunities, but a lot of times, some of those opportunities, we can't necessarily, some of it is our fault, in my opinion, but some of them we can't necessarily walk into, because even though by law, you shouldn't discriminate against anybody for any race, sex, disability, religion, etc. In all reality, we know it still happens. And so I think especially more back then than it is now. So, and even in like the Northwest, like in Missouri, they were still making laws about how free blacks couldn't get an education. And so, I mean, what are you supposed to do, even if you're a free black up north, what are you supposed to do? You can't get an education. Yeah, you can teach yourself how to read and write. You can't go to school. You can't, I mean, I think there was like the first black doctor and lawyer happened around the time of his speech. And those were just two black people, you know, one black lawyer, one black doctor. I mean, do you expect all of the black community to now just go and, okay, it's just gonna take time?
And what I just looked up, so Lincoln wasn't president until 1861. So he was definitely not top.
So one of my questions is, that should Douglas have been such an integrationist as he was? Because again, he did support the feminism movement. He did support people in other races and religions. And he did use those people, whites and feminism and all this, to help elevate the black community. And I remember we had discussions earlier about should you be such an integrationist or should you be a separatist? Because he was against moving to Africa. He was against black people just having their own sort of communities. And so my question is, do you agree with that strategy?
I agree with this strategy, but I think that his way about presenting the strategy wasn't effective as much, because of the fact that he wasn't able to be diverse in his teachings to the black community.
I was just gonna say, like, I do understand the counter argument to that. It's like, when you ally with other causes, you're kind of diluting the movement. But at that point in time, there weren't that many free blacks and there weren't that many white abolitionists that you really had fighting for you. So allying with these causes, it gave you numbers, and that's kind of what we needed to help progress through things. So I do understand why he did it and the importance of doing it.
And that's what I was gonna say, was it a strategy? Because if you know anything about women's suffrage, it started with this abolitionist movement. So they already intertwined, he's already, I'm sure, conversing back and forth with these groups. So I don't know how much it was really that. I kind of think he really felt that it wasn't just a strategy or a political move, that he probably did see the need for that. But I do understand keeping your aim pure, but sometimes that's hard in trying to, that's why some of us are against coalitions. So some people say coalition is what it is. You don't like this, but I'm getting ready to say, don't shoot me, but even when you get married, that's a coalition, it's a compromise, it's a give and take. So anytime you join hands with any other person or group, it has to be some kind of give and take. And that's probably gonna water down something. You don't like that, I see you smile, but you all get the point. What time is it? Is it time to go?
We have 9 minutes.
And we got 9 minutes? Okay. Let me go back to a previous thing about this being forced to choose. Y'all, I know you couldn't be in America and not heard about this royal wedding that took place, right? And so this Meghan Markle talks about, again, the incident that happened with her mother. That she heard her mother call, the N-word, blah, 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 she saw the pain. So I thought she tried real hard to bring in her black side. But at the same time, I'm speaking as an individual now, I cannot help but still see that you seem to gravitate towards, like, your best friends are white, your previous husband was white, this one was white. And again, my point is not that there's anything wrong with that, but people do think in those terms. And so when you see biracial person, is this part of who Frederick Douglass was? Also, he was in the house when he was a slave. He was not a field Negro, as we say. He was a house slave. Is this, how much credence should we give to this in him being more conservative in his political approach to dealing with the black?
That's exactly what I was going to say before she even said it. So, I think that the condition that he has, or that he was in as far as how he saw white people, did come from the fact that he had a white father. Regardless of how his father, birthed him and how he came into this world, he was always able to, sit with the fact that, hey, I have this white blood in me. So that's why I feel like he kind of had this unrealistic approach to integration, because he had that connection that most black people were not able to have. And that's why other black people probably were not able to relate to as much, of his ideas. It was really just because of that. And that's just kind of why he was able to think so heavily about, hey, white people and black people, we can be together, because he was able to think about where he came from. And that's kind of, why he thought that.
You could tell he was a deep thinker if you read his slave narratives. A very deep thinker, he thought about everything. And so maybe he struggled with this too. I don't know.
And, one of my other questions is, should Douglas have reconciled with his slave master's mistress?
I mean, you guys did say she was the nicest to him, and she did teach him to read and among other things, so he probably felt a connection to her just because she was nice, and because he kind of, not to credit his accomplishments to her, but if he did know how to read and write, like, he wouldn't be able to do what he was doing in his life, so like,
It's like, why would he not
yeah.
reconcile with her? You know, knowing that his roots came from her, because if it's the mistress, that means that she was married to the master. Usually in those days, the mistress didn't like the slave owner's children. They were treated the worst out of all the children on the plantation. So for her to have an open heart and be loving in her way, loving towards him to want to teach him how to read and write, I think that, he feels there's an obligation there, no matter who your parents are or where you come from. You're always gonna have that, especially as a child, because we're so forgiving as children. And all we want is to feel that love. And if he wasn't getting it, and I don't think he was able to get it from his mother because they were separated. So for all intents and purposes, she was that mother figure. So why would he not want to reconcile her?
So do y'all also see that as like part of the whole, him having this connection to the white community? Because it's just like, he kind of was like white.
He's good white folk.
Yeah.
So I want you to pull out the major points and bring it so we can visibly see it, your own. What are colored people doing for themselves? That's where we're gonna start on Wednesday, the first 20 to 30 minutes of class. We're gonna deal with what are colored people doing for themselves. And then the next half, we're going to make the BT Washington.